In 1926, a wealthy Toronto lawyer died, and his will contained a single, strange instruction. His fortune would go to whichever woman in the city gave birth to the most children over the following 10 years. He was not confused, and he was not sentimental about family values. He was, by every account that survives him, a lifelong practical joker, and this was, as far as anyone can tell, his last and biggest joke. Except almost nobody in Toronto was laughing, because for a lot of desperate families living through the worst years of the Great Depression, this ridiculous contest was not a punchline at all. It was quite possibly the only real chance at money they were ever going to get, and the whole city was about to spend the next decade finding out exactly how far people would go to win it. Nobody involved could have predicted just how many lawyers, how many newspaper headlines, and how much genuine heartbreak a single paragraph of legal text was about to create. The man behind all of this was named Charles Vance Millar, a hugely successful Toronto lawyer and financier who had spent decades quietly building a personal fortune through sharp, well-timed investments. He never married, had no children of his own, and had developed a well-known reputation around the city as a compulsive practical joker, the kind of wealthy bachelor who apparently found it more entertaining to mess with people than to simply leave them money in the ordinary, boring way. When Millar died suddenly in October of 1926, Toronto assumed his will would finally reveal something serious about the man. Instead, it turned out to be less a legal document and more a carefully constructed final prank, aimed squarely at the entire city he left behind. Friends and business associates who knew him described a man who genuinely enjoyed watching people react to his schemes almost as much as he enjoyed the money itself, and by the time of his death he had spent years quietly perfecting exactly this kind of elaborate, long-fused practical joke. Before we even get to the part everyone remembers, you need to hear what else was actually in this will, because it sets the tone perfectly. Millar left shares in a brewery company to a group of Protestant ministers who were well-known, outspoken supporters of prohibition, on the condition that they actually hold on to the stock. He left shares in a horse racing track to a handful of Toronto's most vocal anti-gambling campaigners, people who had spent years publicly condemning racetrack betting. And he left joint ownership of a vacation home to 3 local lawyers who were known to genuinely despise one another, forcing them to somehow figure out shared custody of a house none of them actually wanted to share. Every single bequest was a pointed joke aimed at somebody's public reputation. The baby contest was simply the biggest one. Legal historians have since pointed out that Millar seems to have deliberately chosen recipients who would be personally embarrassed or professionally compromised by accepting his gifts, which suggests the entire document was engineered from the very first line as one long, connected act of mischief rather than a series of unrelated jokes. The actual clause was almost insultingly simple once you read it. The remainder of Millar's estate, once liquidated into cash exactly 10 years after his death, would go to whichever woman residing in Toronto had given birth to the greatest number of children during that decade. No other qualification, no charitable purpose, no explanation offered anywhere in the document. At the time it was written, this looked like a fairly small, if bizarre, footnote buried in an eccentric millionaire's paperwork. Almost nobody involved could have guessed just how large that eventual payout was actually going to become, or how seriously an entire city, in the middle of an economic catastrophe, was about to take it. There was no cap on how many children would count, no requirement about marital status spelled out in plain language, and no guidance at all for how the courts should handle the messy, very human edge cases that were, in hindsight, always going to show up eventually. Here is the detail that turns this from a quirky historical footnote into something genuinely darker. Millar's 10-year clock started running in 1926, which meant it was going to finish right in the depths of the Great Depression, a period of mass unemployment, evictions, and real desperation across Toronto and the rest of Canada. For a comfortable, wealthy family, a contest like this might have stayed a joke forever. For families who had just lost a job, a home, or any reliable income at all, a share of a $500,000 fortune, an amount worth close to $9 million today, was not remotely funny. It was potentially the difference between poverty and financial security for the rest of their lives, and plenty of people were entirely willing to compete for it in deadly earnest. Soup kitchens, breadlines, and mass evictions were common sights in the city during these same years, which made a stranger's enormous, oddly conditioned fortune look a lot less like an amusing curiosity and a lot more like a genuine lifeline worth fighting for. As word spread and the years ticked by, this stopped being a private legal curiosity and turned into an open, public spectacle. Local newspapers began openly tracking which women in the city were in the running, publishing informal tallies of who currently had the most children born since Millar's death, essentially turning family size into a running headline for the entire decade. Some families leaned into the competition with genuine enthusiasm, having child after child specifically with the prize money in mind. Public opinion split hard. Some Torontonians treated the whole thing as harmless, entertaining civic gossip. Others were openly disgusted, arguing that a dead man's joke was actively pressuring struggling women into repeated pregnancies purely for cash, during the worst possible economic conditions to be doing it. Reporters reportedly went so far as to interview competing families directly, turning what should have been an intensely private matter into front-page material for years at a stretch, and more than one newspaper ran regular scoreboards listing the current leading contenders by name. Predictably, Millar's own relatives were furious about watching a fortune slip away to strangers over what they saw as an obviously tasteless practical joke, and they took the fight to court, arguing the entire bequest should be thrown out as being against public policy, essentially claiming no court should legally enforce what amounted to a baby-making contest. Ontario's government reportedly even explored legislation that could have redirected the money entirely. But the courts, after extended argument, ultimately upheld the will almost exactly as written. Millar, whatever else you think of him, had drafted his final joke with enough legal precision that it was genuinely difficult to strike down, and the contest was allowed to run its full 10 years exactly as he had specified. The case wound through multiple levels of the Canadian court system, and at various points different judges reached different conclusions about how much of the will could actually survive contact with existing law, which only added to the sense that nobody, including the legal system itself, was entirely sure how to handle a bequest this strange. While all of this legal drama played out, the actual prize money was doing something almost as strange as the contest itself. Years earlier, Millar had made a small, $2 investment in a plot of land sitting right next to what would eventually become the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, one of the busiest border crossings between Canada and the United States. As that tunnel project developed, that tiny original investment ballooned into more than $100,000 all on its own. Combined with his other holdings, by the time the full estate was finally liquidated in 1936, it had grown to roughly $568,000, meaning the prize the whole city had been fighting over for a decade had actually gotten significantly bigger while everyone was arguing about whether it should exist at all. Millar's own lawyers were reportedly just as surprised as anyone else watching the estate's value climb year after year, since nothing about the original $2 land purchase had ever looked like anything more than a minor, forgettable side investment at the time he made it. As the 10-year deadline finally approached, the case took its cruelest turn yet. Two women, Lillian Kenny and Pauline May Clark, both appeared to be strong contenders for the top prize. Kenny was disqualified because two of her children had been stillborn, and the courts ultimately ruled that Millar's will, however loosely worded, only intended to count live births. Clark was disqualified because several of her 10 children had been born outside of marriage, and the courts ruled the will implicitly meant legitimate children only. Both rulings were technically defensible readings of an ambiguous document. Both also meant two women who had, by any ordinary reading of the word, genuinely won the count, walked away from the main prize entirely, based on legal distinctions their own children had absolutely no say in. Supporters of both women argued publicly that punishing children for the circumstances of their birth, or for a stillbirth nobody could have controlled, turned an already uncomfortable contest into something considerably crueler than Millar himself likely ever intended. Kenny and Clark did not simply walk away empty-handed, though. Facing the prospect of a long, expensive, and uncertain further appeal, both women ultimately accepted an out-of-court settlement of $12,500 each in exchange for formally dropping their claims. It was a real amount of money for the era, more than most working families would see in several years combined, but it was still a small fraction of the roughly $125,000 the eventual official winners were about to walk away with. Whether that settlement was fair compensation or a quiet way to make an uncomfortable legal problem disappear quickly depends entirely on who in Toronto you asked at the time. When the 10 years finally ran out in 1936, the court declared not one winner, but four. Annie Catherine Smith, Kathleen Ellen Nagel, Lucy Alice Timlek, and Isabel Mary McLean had each given birth to exactly 9 qualifying children during the decade, an almost unbelievable four-way tie for the very top of the list. Rather than trying to split hairs any further, the judge simply divided Millar's swollen fortune evenly between all four women, each walking away with approximately $125,000, worth something close to $2 million in today's money. For four Toronto families who had spent a full decade in the middle of the Great Depression, it was a genuinely life-changing amount of money, delivered as the punchline to a dead stranger's decade-long joke. Toronto crowds and photographers reportedly gathered outside the courthouse to see the final ruling delivered in person, treating the announcement less like routine estate law and more like a prize-fight decision after 10 full years of build-up. The Great Stork Derby, as Toronto newspapers had nicknamed it almost from the very beginning, remained a genuine sensation for the entire decade it ran, and it has quietly outlived its own headlines by nearly a century since. Law schools across Canada still reference Millar's will as a classic case study in exactly how far a legally binding document can push the boundaries of taste, public policy, and enforceability before a court finally has to draw a hard line. Whether you see Charles Vance Millar as a harmless eccentric having one last laugh, or as a wealthy man who turned genuine human desperation into a decade-long spectacle for his own amusement, his single strange paragraph of legal text quietly reshaped several real families' entire futures, whether he ever actually intended it to or not. Documentaries, podcasts, and law school lectures have all revisited the story since, usually landing on the same uneasy conclusion, that it is somehow both a genuinely funny piece of Canadian trivia and a real story about real families making real, difficult choices under real financial pressure. So the next time somebody tells you a will is just boring paperwork, remember the Toronto lawyer who turned his own death into a decade-long, citywide baby contest, sparked a Great Depression-era media circus, survived multiple court challenges from his own furious relatives, and ended up handing four ordinary families a life-changing fortune, purely because he thought it would be funny. Some pranks fade in a day. This one quietly rewrote several real families' lives, and lawyers are still talking about it. If true stories like this are exactly what you come here for, follow along, because history keeps proving it doesn't need any exaggeration at all.